Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you all for coming for the 8th lecture of a symposium of Aristotelian studies. I'm Professor Simão Nascimento, the organizer of the symposium and the host for this meeting. As usual, I'd like to thank FAPERJ and CAPES for their financial support and the member of the research groups Pragma, Uzi, and Polyphonia for their academic support. Today, we're joined by Professor Mariska Leunissen, who is delivering our lecture, and to debate the lecture, we have Professor Lucas Angione, Roberto Grasso, and Breno Zupolini. So let me personally thank them all for joining us today, and without any more delay, welcome Professor Leunissen to our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. Mariska, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for having me. Let's see. Is my screen sharing? Yes, there it is. Is this big enough for everyone to follow? Otherwise, I can make the screen bigger, but if this is okay, I'd like to start like this. So my paper today is on the way that Aristotle studied women in his natural sciences. In particular, I'm interested in the question of how Aristotle established the facts about women in his natural sciences, facts which may then have played a role in informing his theories, which are of course notorious. And then in particular, I'm interested in seeing whether Aristotle, in establishing those facts, ever treated women as sources of knowledge about their own bodies and experiences themselves. So basically, I'm looking for anything that shows that Aristotle engaged with women as like people with experiences and knowledge themselves, as opposed to just objects in his theories and vehicles for reproduction. Let me see if I can turn off my AC here. 1 second. Okay. So I'm going to say a little bit more about the broader context of the project. So a big question I've been working on the past couple of years, on and off, mostly off this past year, is on how Aristotle establishes facts in the natural sciences. So as most people know, for Aristotle, scientific inquiry consists in 2 stages. The first one is the fact establishing phase. And then once we've gathered all or most of the facts, we then move on to providing the explanations. Now, most of the research has focused on the explanation part of the story because that's where most of the interesting action happens. And the first phase, especially in the natural sciences, seems pretty straightforward. So Aerosol tells us multiple times that the facts have to be established by reference to observations or observational experience, where Aristotle is not just saying like, look, anyone could just open their eyes and see what is relevant. It might be that you need some kind of training to see what's going on during dissections. You also have to observe things for the sake of knowing. But if you have the right kind of observational experience, the facts should be able to, that's how you settle the facts. And so what I've been interested in is cases where this kind of methodological requirement comes under pressure. So cases where the phenomena that are at stake are sort of out of reach. So, or where there's not enough observations available to settle the matter. So these are cases like heavenly bodies, exotic animals, processes that go on inside of bodies, so embryogenesis, for instance. So Aerosol can cut open pregnant animals, but that always just gives you a snapshot in time. You can't capture the process itself very well through immediate observation. So I've been looking at what Aristotle does, what kind of strategies he has in dealing with these kind of cases. And it turns out that Aristotle has many of them, that he's very inventive in coming up with solutions to tie his the decisions on what are the facts to observations in one way or another. So he relies on inferences from signs, use of analogy, probabilistic reasoning, all these kinds of things. And then I have something to say about what then the status is of these kinds of statements of facts, because it seems like what we get, since no immediate observation is possible. We can't know these things for certain. And so Aristotle seems to advise us that in those cases, what we're going for is a certain amount of credibility. So we should check whether the statements of fact have enough pistis, and if they do, then we incorporate them into our scientific explanations. So that's sort of the rough outline of the project itself. Now, there's some questions that are still remaining that I would like to work on further. One is sort of, which seems like a basic question, but what is really, like, what do we mean by Aristotle's empiricism? And by that, I don't have in mind sort of questions about justification, so I don't want to get into the whole metaphysics and posterior analytics debate about whether Aristotle is ultimately a rationalist or an empiricist. I think that's an interesting debate, but that would be a whole nother sort of book project. There's also lots of interesting connections with, what Aristotle's basically doing is making the invisible visible. And there's lots of other people, scientists of the time, who are trying to do the same thing. And so there seem to be interesting connections between what Aristotle's doing and what we find in Hippocratic and Herodotus. So that I would like to do, but I don't think I have time for that. So what I am interested in is sort of a more basic question, and like that is, what does it really mean for Aristotle to have observations settle facts? Like, what counts as observation? Sometimes it seems that when people talk about empiricism in Aristotle, they seem to suggest that Aristotle is going for some kind of objectivity, or that he's aiming for some view from nowhere. But what seems to me is that in some of these passages, Aristotle's actually suggesting that we need to actively assume the truth of natural teleology and sort of have that guide our observations. So what exactly is entailed by that? So that's sort of a very vague sort of methodological question. And then there's some specific questions about women in that project, about empirical mistakes in general, and specifically about the mistakes he makes about women. So in one sense, women are among the objects that seem to be relevant for this project. So women are visible. They're not like exotic animals sort of far away from Aristotle. But in many other ways, it seems like their lives, their experiences, their bodies are hidden from the male gaze, like the women, at least according to the ideal, where women's places within the household and properly clothed and whatever. And so Ido seems to be standing in the way for Aristotle to study women. And the other thing is that it seems that what I'm doing with the project is basically painting this picture of Aristotle as this really amazing, creative empiricist. And that makes these mistakes about women, like really dumb mistakes about women, stand out even stronger. Like, it raises question, like, if Aerosol was so great at using all of the observational data available to them, why did he say such dumb things about women? So I put a couple of examples on the handout and also here on this slide. So he says stuff like, in the case of humans, sheep, goats, and pigs, males have more teeth than females. In the case of other animals, observations have not been made, which is really curious because it suggests that somebody at least has made observations about human women having fewer teeth than men. And another notorious example is, of course, the one about women when they have their period and they look into a mirror, they stain the mirror red. Both of these examples, and there are many others, would have been easily sort of falsified if Aristotle actually looked. Now, there's a huge literature on these mistakes about women. My rough caricature of that literature is that it basically falls apart into two camps. So one group of scholars says, well, these mistakes are just due to oopsies caused by, Aristotle's flawed character. So either he just forgot to look, he assumed that he already knew, and so he didn't have to look, or Even worse, Aerosol is just this really awful sexist, and this is just an expression of his sexism. So I don't necessarily think this is false. I think Aristotle, like maybe everyone, most people of his time, was sexist to a certain degree. And certainly he must have thought that he knew several things already about women, preventing him from looking. But I'd like to know more, like what kept him. Why did he think that he already knew? And I'd also like to say more about, like, the sexism doesn't really explain why we have these mistakes and not other mistakes. The case of having fewer teeth does not strike me as a particular hard blow to the status of women. So that's one group of the literature. And then the other part seems to be sort of wanting to exonerate Aristotle and rescue him as the greatest philosopher of science of antiquity. And these scholars basically come up with ways to point out that the evidence that Aerosol is working with was flawed. So it's not Aristotle who made the mistake, but he was working with imperfect evidence. And so we have some examples of that on this slide. And so certainly it's true that women in antiquity, we have archaeological evidence for that, suffered more from dental disease. But the fact that they were more prone to losing teeth during their life does not really explain to me this, statement, blank statement that women had fewer teeth. That's a different kind of thing. And so this kind of approach seems misguided to me, and also too ad hoc. And so what I'd like to come up with, or at least try out, is a kind of more methodological account that explains these mistakes in terms of what Aerosol is doing. So having a better understanding of how Aerosol actually studies women might tell us better why he made certain mistakes as opposed to others. And also might give us a better understanding of what underlies all of these theories of women that Aerosol presents, building on those facts in the biological treatises and the ethics. So that then got me to the question of how did Aerosol actually study women. I realized that I didn't really have a good answer to that. So if a student asked me this question in an intro to ancient class, I would probably say something like, well, when Aerosol wanted to study sheep, there were lots of sheep in Attica. Presumably, Aerosol would have gone to the specialists, the shepherds, and asked them about what they knew about sheep and their lives and their reproduction, and etc. And then he would have observed sheep himself. So probably live sheep. He might have dissected a couple of them. And then presumably he would have checked the reports he would have gotten from the shepherds against the things he observed himself, and then saved the things that harmonized, and then rejected or reinterpreted the things that did not harmonize. So presumably we should find something similar in the case of women. So Aristotle presumably asked specialists about their views about women. And then the question is, like, who were these specialists, and were women included among the specialists about themselves? And the second step would then have been, or maybe this step would have been in conjunction, to observe women or ask women about their opinions about these things. So I went through the secondary literature, and I found very little about this question about like what Aristotle's investigation of women actually looked like. The two best suggestions I got from a paper by Leslie Dean Jones. So she presents this kind of probabilistic argument. So she says, look, given how important this methodological requirement was for Aristotle to start with the gathering of evidence, with the facts, and then going on to provide his own explanations, it would be inconceivable that Aristotle would have failed to do this on the topic of women too. And then she goes on to argue that Book 10 of the History of Animals, which we know as On Sterility, and which is mostly, I think most people think, is not actually written by Aristotle. So she argues that the first five chapters of that book were written by some kind of maybe Hippocratic physician, that Aristotle included or incorporated those writings wholesale as part of his fact-gathering stage. And then that chapters 6 and 7 are additions by Aristotle himself. So where he offers some responses on this medical treatise. It's clearly some kind of medical treatise. And so that would give us one example of Aristotle's investigation of women in practice. The other passage comes from a terrific book by Sophia Connell. So she says there's evidence that Aristotle, took careful note of what women told him. For instance, he gives us information that seems to come from women about their gestational periods. And then we get another probabilistic argument that says it seems quite likely that many other statements about vaginal discharges, pregnancy, and birth came from women themselves, both midwives and mothers. And so part of what I'm doing in this paper is kind of writing an elaborate footnote to this observation by Sophia Connell, trying to figure out what this evidence looks like and whether Aerosol actually got the facts that he mentions in his biological treatises from women themselves. So that's sort of a key question. Okay. So there's 4 topics that are of interest to me where I want to zoom in on how Aerosol establishes the facts. And these all have to do with motherhood. So it's basically, I'm going to trace a woman's journey into motherhood and to the 4 phases that we can find in Aristotle. So conception itself, the duration of the pregnancy, childbirth, and then the maternal bond that mother and child form after birth. The first 2 of these are more technically related to this question of whether or not Aristotle treated women themselves as sources of knowledge about their own experiences and their own bodies. And I'm going to be focusing most closely on those 2 topics in this talk. The next 2, so childbirth and the maternal bond, it's less clear to me there what Aristotle's sources are, but I like to talk about them because they seem to include a kind of awareness of Aristotle that there are special experiences or feelings or affections that belong to mothers alone, that he has some knowledge of them and that he tries to incorporate them or has them play some kind of role in his ethical treatises. The last one, the maternal bond, is the one that's most under construction. And so I'm going to be the shortest about that one because I haven't quite figured out yet what I want to say about that. Okay, so starting with the role of female pleasure. So by female pleasure, I mean female orgasm. So Aerosol does not have a separate term for that. So just to highlight that point, Aerosol talks about female pleasure and its role in conception twice in the generation of animals. So the first time he does so is in the context of settling the question of whether or not women or female animals in general contribute something to reproduction. The second time is in Generation of Animals 2:4, when Aristotle is getting ready to give us a chronological description of the process of embryogenesis. So that whole narrative starts with the male orgasm, and then there's a question of whether the female orgasm needs to go in there too before we start with the discussion of the fetus and the progression of how the limbs develop. Now, both of those contexts seem to be colored by this debate that Aristotle has with the Hippocratics. So the looming competitive theory that is at stake is this pangenesis, two-seed theory that the Hippocratics present. So I want to say a little bit about that before diving into the actual materials. So for the Hippocratics, both the male and the female contribute seed to reproduction. And for them, pleasure or orgasm is important. It's an important piece of evidence, right? So it provides evidence that seed is derived from the whole body. So the relaxation and exhaustion that you feel all over is a sign that seed has left all of your bodily parts. It's also a sign that both the male and the female contribute to reproduction. So in the male, the emission of seed and the orgasm take place at the same time. So that's visual evidence that those two phenomena go together, such that in the female, you can then use their orgasm as a sign for the invisible process of the release of seed inside of her uterus at the same time. So for the Hippocratics, it's very important that these two phenomena sort of go together and are causally related. Aerosol, of course, wants to argue that, yes, the female contributes something to reproduction, but it's not seed, technically speaking. It's her menses that have this spermatic role for him. So in arguing against this Hippocratic position, Aerosol goes through a whole series of empirical evidence, and pretty careful empirical evidence. A couple of things are interesting about this. So what he's trying to do very carefully is to undermine the claim that the female orgasm, that female pleasure, is a sign for the female release of some kind of spermatic fluid. So he wants to undermine that claim. At the same time, he wants to save all the phenomena that are reported by the Hippocratics. So he wants to accept the fact that women have pleasure, experience pleasure during sex, that this is important for reproduction, that there's a fluid that is released in association with female pleasure. And then the only claim is that that fluid is not spermatic. It's not what women contribute to reproduction. So I put the list of evidence that Aristotle talks about on this slide there. So most of them are labeled explicitly as signs. So first sign, women conceive without experiencing pleasure. Second sign, women experience pleasure without conceiving. Thank goodness. So these two signs combined sort of undermine the causal connection between having pleasure and there being conception. The third piece of evidence is something that looks like it's something that people say and builds on some kind of weird cultural stereotype. So he says the fluid that is released during the female orgasm from the uterus is not present in all women. So it's only present in women who are white and feminine. It's not present in women who are tanned and masculine. And since all women are supposed to be reproducing, this fluid cannot be spermatic. A further sign is Aristotle says that men and women experience sort of the location of pleasure in the same analogous spot. But this is not the spot from which the fluids flow in the female. So I think what Aristotle's getting at here is that he's discovered the clitoris, which I think is pretty impressive for Aristotle, given that he didn't know how many teeth women have. This is sort of impressive. And then the final piece of empirical evidence he considers is something that the Hippocratics use as a sign, namely the fact that women also experience erotic or wet dreams and then wake up wet. And so Aristotle says, well, that doesn't indicate anything because boys and fertile men also have wet dreams and wake up wet, but what they release during this wet dream is not actually spermatic. It does not have any powers for reproduction. So that's a negative part. And then in the positive part, so when Aristotle gives his own account of what's going on. A couple of things are interesting there. So the fact establishing and the sort of explaining what's going on there end up being mixed. So when Aristotle reinterprets the facts, he does it very clearly from a teleological perspective. So Aristotle says, although female pleasure is not necessary for conception, it is for the better. So, and for the most part, conception does happen when women experience pleasure during sex, and that is because the pleasure is supposed to open up the mouth of the uterus, and that provides for an easier passage of the male semen. And then secondly, he offers a teleological reason why the fluid that is emitted by the uterus during the experience of pleasure cannot be spermatic. And that is that it would be in vain for nature to first sort of spit something out of the uterus that then needs to be absorbed back in, because it's in the uterus that actual reproduction takes place. Right, so if nature wanted the woman to have seed available in the uterus for reproduction, it would deposit that in the uterus and not outside of it, which is of course where the female menses end up being. So the teleological reinterpretation of what the facts are is interesting. The second thing, and this is the second layer on this slide there, is that the structure of the argument that Aristotle offers here follows very closely the argumentative structure of History of Animals, Book 10, this treatise on sterility that I just mentioned. So the first 5 chapters of that book mention 5 or 6 times this phenomenon of women having wet dreams, and uses that as evidence for the fact that women contribute something to reproduction. And so what Aerosol does is sort of accept all the facts of that story, except for the meaning of, except for the role of those fluids that are contributed by women during their wet dreams. And then this rejection of this fluid being spermatic matches with a claim that Aristotle makes if it's Aristotle, in text 21. So this is History of Animals, book 10, chapter 7, where he sort of calls into question this idea: if women were to contribute something to reproduction through this process, why wouldn't women be able to reproduce on their own? So if their uterus could eject spermatic semen into the vaginal canal and then suck it back up and then produce embryos out of it, why does it necessarily, why do we even need to mix in the male seed if the female seed already has everything that is required? And so it seems to me that this whole discussion, everything that Aristotle knows here seems to be coming fairly directly from the Hippocratics, and endorsing everything that women are reported to say by the Hippocratics, but rejecting the Hippocratic interpretation. Okay, so that's one. Secondly, yes, okay. Because women, check. Okay. So Aristotle seems to believe that women know when they have conceived. So this is another, it seems to be like a widespread endoxa among the ancients. I can't quite trace down how widespread it is, but there's this idea that present in the Hippocratics, that dryness in the vaginal area right after sex means that, or indicates that the uterus has drawn up all of the male seed into the uterus, where it then goes on to form the embryo. So couple of things that are interesting about this sign in Aristotle. So the History of Animals is full of signs. Like Aristotle talks about diseases, pregnancy, fertility, and mentions lots of signs in the process. Most of those are for breeders, right, or for whoever is the expert dealing with these animals. They are for others to see and draw inferences about the bodies of these animals at stake. So this particular sign is marked as Aristotle as being for women, like for being for women only, so that they know that they have conceived. I added some passages from the Hippocratic treatises that sort of support this idea that this is something that women told each other. So if they noticed that the seed did not run out of them, that was a sign that they were pregnant. And again, Aerosol seems to accept that also in this chapter HA 10.7, if that is indeed by Aristotle. It's a puzzling sign to me because it's not clear to me why Aristotle would have to accept this. Given Aristotle's theory of reproduction, there's no need for all the male seed to make it into the uterus. The male seed does not contribute anything material to the embryo. And it's not clear that only a little bit couldn't carry the whole, motions that transmit, the form transmitting motions. Anyway, and then he also discusses a bunch of later signs that also seem to be mostly for women themselves, so that they have indications that they're pregnant. So some sensations in the flanks or the groin, some kind of heaviness, which might refer to bloating, migraines, and nausea, which all seem fairly accurate as signs of early pregnancy. And again, this whole list seemed to come, or at least maps on fairly well to a similar list that we find in the Hippocratic treatises. So as far as I can tell, this comes again from the Hippocratics. Now, because Aerosol thinks that women know when they have conceived, they also are reliable sources of knowledge when it comes to how long they've carried their pregnancies. So Aerosol again makes this claim, seemingly following the Hippocratics, that though all animals have a set period of gestation, humans have a flexible range of gestation, ranging from like 6 months to even reports of 11 months. And so Aristotle claims that within that range, babies born in the 7th and in 9 months usually live, but those born in the 8 months typically die, especially those born in Greece. And he says this hypolepsis, this assumption is so strong that when a child is born during an earlier or later month and still dies, women assume that they must have made a mistake in their calculation. And what I think is interesting here is that Aristotle, like if he were purely motivated by sexism, right, he could have said any kind of negative thing about, how women suck at thinking or calculating or something like that. But instead, what he offers here is a kind of naturalistic explanation of why women would make this mistake, right? So he says it sometimes happens that the uterus fills with wind. Lord knows how that exactly happens. But that produces signs that are similar to those of early pregnancy. So it's sort of understandable that women misinterpret those signs for early pregnancy signs. And again, the source of that seems to be the Hippocratic. So I put all those texts on the handout. Some more general conclusions then. Again, Aristotle in this context doesn't seem to challenge the knowledge that women have over conception and over the duration of their pregnancies, which I think is striking because several of these endoxa that he's accepting are in fact false. And so it might be that what he's doing here is sort of like a double layer of buying into the authority that the Hippocratics have, and then the authority that the Hippocratics himself assign to women concerning pregnancy. So famously, the Hippocratics are not too big on, women being well aware or well versed in questions about the health of their own bodies. They need male physicians to interfere, right? I mean, in a way, the Hippocratic physicians are in competition with other women, and they're setting themselves up as the experts on women's bodies. But when it comes to pregnancy, we have several of these passages where the Hippocratics refer their own knowledge back to women who are experienced with pregnancies, and these are most notably prostitutes. And we also have these passages where they explicitly say, look, whatever a woman tells you about what's going on inside of her body when she's pregnant, that's, we should go with that. There's no way you can talk women out of believing whatever they already know about their own bodies. So I think that's interesting. So it looks like Aerosol's piggybacking off of the authority the Hippocratics assigned to these women, without, it seems like, then feeling the need to go check on what's going on with these women himself. The other thing that's notable is that Aristotle just never mentions his sources. So in the history of animals, we have tons of references, to Herodotus, to tragedy writers, to physicians, to shepherds, to beehive keepers. He's very happy to mention the sources of his knowledge. He's completely silent about where he gets his knowledge about women. And this, again, in contrast to the Hippocratics, who are very... there's at least two of these very strong passages where the Hippocratic author claims, I know all of this stuff because I talked to a prostitute who are allegedly experienced with these phenomena, and potentially not prohibited by shame to talk about them with some male physician. Okay, so that's sort of on the side of like what Aristotle learns from women themselves. Moving on to, let's see. Okay, there we go. To his taking into account women's experiences. So next step in this journey is childbirth, which was, of course, a big deal in antiquity, very risky for both mother and child. I included this famous line from Medea, who says, these men are complaining that we live these safe lives inside of our homes and don't run any risks, while they stand out on the battlefield. And then she says, I would much rather stand behind a shield 3 times over than give birth just once. And it's interesting to me that Aristotle sort of recognizes that childbirth is this very risky business for women in antiquity. So in the history of animals and also in the generation of animals, we find surprisingly very little about the actual birth experience, right? So Aristotle has lots to say about when animals give birth, to how many offspring they give birth, what season they do this, sort of all the quantitative information. We get very little qualitative observations of what goes on with animals during labor and birth. And the few cases that I have found are kind of fable-like or explicitly in the context of Aristotle sort of drawing comparisons with what we see among animals and then how that resembles the lives of humans. And interestingly, all of these examples also pertain to birds, and there's some, I haven't quite traced this further, but there's some connections between women and birds in some of the literary sources. So he does talk about the qualitative experiences for women, so for human animals. And so he says that for most animals, birth is not painful, for human females, this is extremely painful, or it's the most painful of all. And this is especially true for women in Greece, and especially more true for women who are young. So I won't go into the background of how exactly Aristotle explains this. Has to do with Greek women, with women in general having more menses, these menses not being used up very much yet by the developing embryo in the early phases of pregnancy. And then women in Greece are more sedentary than women elsewhere, so they don't use up those materials, etc. But we get this we get a passage that seems to differentiate between different kinds of labor, which I also thought was pretty sophisticated. So Aristotle recognizes that. And then what I think is interesting is that in the politics, some of the regulations Aerosol proposes in the context of this creation of this ideal city, sort of his advice to future lawgivers, seem to directly mitigate these dangers of childbirth for women. So setting the proper age of marriage for women to be 18 instead of the traditional Athenian age of 14 or 15. So that alone would reduce the risk of childbirth for these very young women substantially. And then there's also this other comment that that always seemed weird and sort of paternalistic to me, where Aristotle says, we should make sure that women take good care of their bodies, and we do that by having them walk daily to the temple of the gods associated with childbirth. But read in the context of these earlier passage where Aristotle stresses, women who have more practice in holding their breath do better during childbirth than women who are more active during their pregnancies, also have easier deliveries. I think that gives a nice little perspective on what this is for. So it's actually something that really serves women well if followed. And then the last thing I wanted to mention in this context is, so I've been looking for, mostly in vain, for references of attributions of skill, of wisdom, of knowledge to women by Aristotle. And so again, on the handout, I give you this contrast between the Hippocratics who say, there's quite a lot of knowledge and care involved in carrying babies to term and giving birth to them and keeping them alive. There's no such parallel that I found in Aristotle, but he does have this nice passage about a midwife, where he says these midwives are both, they need to have very skilled hands or quick hands, and quick-witted. They need to be able to think quickly on their feet. So they need to be able to make decisions about when to cut the umbilical cord, which is don't wait too long and don't do it too quickly. And he also mentions some weird phenomenon where it looks like the baby is stillborn, but where the midwife is able to press blood back into the infant through the umbilical cord, and then is able to revive the infant. And so this is the longest, most elaborate passage I've been able to find in Aristotle, where Aristotle talks very positively about the skills of possessed by these women. Okay, so this brings me to the last one. Okay. So this is the topic of the special nature of the maternal bond that forms between mothers and their offspring, starting immediately after birth. So this seems to be a huge topic, and there's lots of stuff that can be said about this. So I want to just focus on a couple of things. So one is that clearly within the natural context, Aristotle has a lot to say about how nature itself implanted in parents and mothers specifically some love for their offspring. And this love lasts longer and runs deeper the more practical intelligence the creature has, which technically only pertains to humans, and the longer the feeding process that is involved in, and the longer parents are required to take care of the infants. And so there's some interesting questions about, like, given how long women are supposed to breastfeed their offspring in antiquity and what Aristotle has to say about that, it seems that women in particular are by nature set up to be those who love their offspring most of everyone else, of all species. Now, this theme surprisingly comes up in the ethical and political treatises. So the first thing I mentioned here on the slide, so text 48, comes from the Politics, where Aerosol says, like, friendship and care are produced by two factors mostly, namely considering something your own and having some kind of loving affection for something. This comment is made in the context of Aerosol critiquing Socrates' design of the ideal city in Plato's Republic, where the suggestion is being made that for the guardians, women and children should be held in common. And I take it that the core of Aristotle's critique is something like, look, Plato, this is just not how human nature works. This does not fit with what humans are like. And what I think is interesting, that both of these factors, so considering something one's own and having loving affection for something, these two facts are both picked up in the ethical treatises. And then Aristotle uses maternal love to illustrate these two factors, and then says that mothers actually are the prime examples of considering something your own and of having loving affection for something. So motherly love is used as a natural paradigm in defining what philia is. So Aristotle says, like, loving and friendship is more about loving than about being loved. And you can see that by women who willingly give up their children to be raised by others and still love them even though they get nothing in return. And then in his analysis of the asymmetrical friendship between benefactors and those who are benefited, he again appeals to this love of mothers. So mothers consider their offspring most of all their own, and this has to do with the fact that children are considered to be most their work. So children are more the work of mothers than they are of fathers. Basically a pun on this, on labor during childbirth. And also because it was more difficult to produce these, and the more difficult it is to produce something, the more you consider that thing your own. So here I have not quite figured out what to make of all of this. So it's interesting to me that Aristotle makes motherly love, which is clearly this asymmetrical and very intense love, as why he uses this as a kind of paradigm, and at the same time excludes women from being able to engage in virtue friendships, unless this is exactly the reason why they can't form these friendships, because their love is so is by nature just asymmetrical, or too much tied to their own offspring, such that they cannot form these bonds with adults in the community. The other question I have is about sort of the sources, like who's Aristotle looking at when he's making these claims about mothers? The only actual examples he gives are from Greek tragedy, so from tragedies we don't have, unfortunately. And so it makes me think that some of this is sort of more based on the dramatic representation of women than on the experience of motherly love by actual women themselves. But again, so this requires a lot more research, and these are just some of my first thoughts about this. Now, finally then, so here are some tentative conclusions. So what are some general things to say at this point? So first thing then, clearly, as has already been remarked by Owen in his famous 1961 article, Tisena ta Phenomena, for Aristotle, the phenomena include both empirical observations that he has made himself, but also things that are being said and opinions held that include observational facts or alleged empirical facts made by others. And so clearly in his treatment of knowledge about women, Aerosol seems to be relying very heavily on verbal reports or written reports by fellow male scientists who then report on women's statements about their own experiences surrounding pregnancy and childbirth, etc. So Owen takes this to be evidence that there's a kind of bifurcation in that, the true phenomena, the empirical observations then go on to play a role in science, and that when Aerosol goes on to rely on these verbal reports, it's dialectic. And I think the picture is a lot more muddled because when Aristotle using these alleged empirical facts that are embedded in verbal reports by others, I think the aspiration is still scientific. And he's still trying to figure out whether these claims have pistis, right? Whether they have some credibility. And that brings me to the second sort of general observation, that it's not clear to me that Aristotle goes out of his way to test these verbal reports of empirical facts against his own observations, as opposed to just testing them against things he already thinks are true or that have credibility already. So, the existence of natural teleology, which has built in it some kind of hierarchy of sexes, but potentially also frameworks like animal husbandry. So that seems to be looming very large in the history of animals. Potentially tragic tropes of motherhood. So it seems to me that if those claims just fit with these kinds of things, Aristotle does not investigate further. And I have not been able to find any clear evidence that Aristotle interviewed women himself. There's no evidence that Aristotle himself went to the prostitutes to ask them about some of these things. And then finally, when you look at, when you get into the thick of this, right, especially in these biological treatises, often this sort of two-staged method of inquiry gets sort of mixed up. So establishing the facts and sort of given explanations or giving Aristotle's own account gets entangled, the two get intertwined. So it's part of, the decision of what counts as a fact and what does not count as a fact sort of gets made in reference to this larger framework of explanations he has already been building up to. And then within that, the context is often highly agonistic, right? So in all of these texts, his main source and opponents seem to have been the Hippocratics. And so we get, in these cases, like this leads both to very detailed, very specific, and some very cool observations, I think. So it's kind of impressive, like how much Aerosol knows about vaginal discharges, right? So the more pressure there is, the more debate there is about a topic, the more investigation Aristotle will do. But it also sort of explains why some of these mistakes are being made. So because some facts already have so much weight and credence in other people's theories, Aristotle is willing to accept them, even though they don't make much sense within his own theory, like the example of the uterus of the uterus drawing up all of the male seed, and that's an indication of pregnancy. And then on the other hand, so it seems to me that cases where Aristotle makes some of these really weird mistakes, or where some of these mistakes go unchecked, might be exactly those cases where nothing hangs on these claims, right? So if there's no debate, if there's no competition going on about teeth, then maybe Aerosol has no incentive to actually go out and check. Okay, so thank you. That was all I had for you today.
Thank you, Mariska, for the very enlightening presentation. We have a few questions here from the debaters, and as usual, we'll go through them before we move on to the audience. But this time, I think I'll begin with the questions. Lucas has a few questions too, and then I think some others will have. So the first thing I would like to ask you about is the whole silence on the Hippocratic sources. When I read your work, it reminded me of an article from a professor called Sarah Francis on the physiology of acrasia that I read back when I was doing my doctorate. And I remember that I was very impressed with the work she did because she showed exactly what you did. Like there was a lot of things that he just happened to pick up from the Hippocratic. So I would like to hear you on this because I don't hear a lot about that, how much Aristotle owes to this tradition. And the second thing is in the conclusion of your slides, when you talk about the fact that he did not interview women and that he was maybe a little bit selective on how he dealt with the facts. I mean, to me, that sounds utterly Aristotelian. I completely follow you on that. I think that sounds like something he would do. But there is something else that I think, by reading the text also, not only the slides, that caught my attention. It's like he gave a certain weight to this supposed facts that were narrated, and he focused somehow on the explanations that were given of them. And in this focus, he seemed to me to be guided by the kinds of constraints that Aristotle thinks that should wait on anybody who tries to give a causal explanation of anything. So it's almost like he picked up the empirical observation from the Hippocratics and was like, okay, so you might be right about that. This is something good you did, but if you're going to reason about the causes, you have to be a little more strict. You have to be a little more careful on that. But I was wondering, do you see that? Like, do you agree with that characterization? And do you think that even in this kind of reasoning, he's also partial? Like, do you think that he lets slide a lot of causal reasoning that he should not have let, stand as it is?
Yeah. So lots of interesting stuff. So starting with the latter, so I do think there are a couple of examples where, like, the idea that women have various periods of gestation, that in humans it can be anywhere between 6 months and 11 months, which seems terrifying to me. Whereas nowhere else in the animal world Aristotle sees this phenomenon, but he seems to just accept that from the Hippocratics. And I think you're right in the sense that, Aristotle, because he's so ambitious, because he wants to explain everything that everyone else is explaining and more, he might be a bit too sort of greedy in what he's accepting as facts. Like if he can make it fit, then maybe he just keeps them in there. What is a little bit odd to me is that within that same discussion in the generation of animals about the female contribution to reproduction, he also talks about the Hippocratic explanation of hereditary factors, hereditary features. So he talks about this idea that, sometimes you have a father with a tattoo on his arm, and then the child is born with like a black mark in the same location. And so about that, Aerosol says something like, well, those are pisana, right? They have some kind of, these facts have some level of credibility. So he wants to do something with them. So it does seem like he's able and sometimes willing to sort of step back and say, wait a minute, like, what do I think about these facts independently of all the other stuff I want to say and do? And to what extent do they carry any credibility? And you get that in the history of animals too, where he says, this is the case about these animals, but about the other ones we don't have enough observations yet. Or I make this claim, and he says this has been observed sufficiently, suggesting like there could be stuff that has not been observed sufficiently. So we're this whole my sense is sort of that he really gets caught up in this like outdoing it's like the Hippocratics have such high stature and like authority, and he's like, I'm going to outdo you. That sort of gets sort of maybe caught up in that. I'm not sure. And then the Sarah Francis article, I love that one because it's I think she's doing exactly the same, just bringing out the parallels, how much Aristotle is actually borrowing from the Hippocratics and how closely he read them. So Sophia Connell just produced this, I just got it in the mail yesterday. It's the Cambridge Companion to Aristotle's Biology. And there's a new paper in there that talks about Aristotle and the Hippocratics, and it's what I'll be reading tonight.
I'm waiting for my copy. There's a Corsilius. Klaus Corsilius has an article on that.
Yes.
I'm waiting for my copy. I will make sure I take a look at it. Thank you for your answer. And now it's Lucas' turn. Let me put him on the screen.
Hello, Mariska.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you for the talk. My question is about that passage on the Somno about the stained mirrors, which is vexing passage. So I'm very, very sympathetic to your tentative conclusion. So the idea that Aristotle is mainly relying on this legomena and endoxa by other people, etc., and he did check them only when there was some, let's just say, some conflict with some other evidence he has. So Aristotle sought for empirical confirmation or refutation, or anyway, he checked the information only when, let's just say, he had a horse on the race, so to speak.
Yep.
But then I wonder what is going on in that text 10, because what strikes me is, probably anyone who reads this passage from the Somno, is that the normal vocabulary to report opinions, endoxa, legomena are not present. Aristotle just states something that seems to be clearly false. He doesn't say, well, people say that the mirror gets stained and we believe. Well, he just say that. And I wonder, so what do you think about that, and why we have some reason to think that this is a sort of more deepest mistake Aristotle has made, maybe more terrible than the others?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I mean, some people just get so upset about this passage and they say it's a later interpolation. Like, this is so crazy. The great Aristotle could not have included this himself. So there's a paper by Philip von der Eyck on this treatise, and I think I buy into it. Like, it clearly illustrates very well the claims that Aristotle's making in this context, that you can have these sort of small motions that continue to affect things outside of the body, even though they were started in the body. So the way that, dreams can have prophetic powers because the motions continue on and then actually move something in the world. So the way it seems to me is that he states it with so much certainty. It's like, everyone knows this, right? So here's this difficult phenomenon that I'm now trying to explain to you about dreams and stuff. But actually, it's just like this case, and we all know this. So you're right that there's not this sort of hedging. There's no like people think this. So in that sense, it's even worse. But maybe it just illustrates that Aristotle's buying into this even more than into some of these other weird claims.
Okay.
Otherwise, I don't know what to make.
I think there's not too much to say about that passage. So I wonder whether someone has tried to get some reasonable explanation for the mistake, like, given Aristotle's causal theory of how bodies interact, and given that in Greece there was some peculiarities of the weather, etc., and the sort of mirrors Aristotle is talking about, etc., it makes the mistake more plausible. But anyway,
it might be possible. Like So menses have these passive potentials for form that maybe if put in motion, I mean, it might be possible to spin some kind of story. I mean, there's a question about like, so sometimes when we talk about these passages, it's like, how could Aerosol have been so stupid? Like, he could have just checked his wife's mouth and counted teeth, or his children. Like, if you have kids, you follow along with like, when they get their teeth and they lose them again, and then they get more. And I don't know, but maybe, it's not clear to me. Maybe women on their period were kept in separate chambers in the house. They were already in separate areas of the house. So how much first-person experience did Aerosol really have with these phenomena? Like, were men present when babies were born, like at the moment of birth? Not clear to me. Yeah. But yes, this is a very puzzling passage. Yeah.
Okay, so satisfied. I think this is it.
Okay, then. Thank you, Lucas. The next in line is Breno, if I'm not mistaken. Let me check. Yes, Breno. So, Breno, welcome.
Hi, Mariska. Thank you very much for your talk. Very interesting. And I have a question on your second tentative conclusion. I was thinking about that distinction that we find in Aristotle's text between justification by perception and justification by logos, by argument or whatever. And it seems that, so I'm going to just briefly read your second tentative conclusion. You say that it's not clear to me that Aristotle tests the latter against his own observations as opposed to testing them for their credibility in light of other things he accepts as true. And say, for instance, the existence of natural teleology, maybe also framework of animal husbandry and tragic tropes of motherhood and so on. That looks like that those things are on the side of justification by argument, I would say. I'm not sure if you would agree. And I was wondering, I'm totally convinced by Joseph Karbalski's paper on Ozap about justification by argument in Aristotle, where he argues that those two methods, those two ways of justifying beliefs are somehow, they are both acceptable, but justification by perception has a certain privilege. Mm-hmm. And justification by argument is welcome, especially when empirical evidence is scarce and so on. And Aristotle criticizes other scientists or philosophers for when they are excessively attached to their own abstract theories and so on.
Right.
And I was wondering whether your second tentative conclusion kind of conflicts with that result of that claim that Karbalski argues in his paper, and more specifically, would you say that this is something that appears to happen in Aristotle investigations on women and motherhood and so on, or would you like to say or to generalize that conclusion as a sort of methodological tendency in Aristotle and so on? So I would like to get a clearer view of what your opinion about that issue is.
Yeah, good. So I definitely I want to generalize this to a kind of, as a general observation of Aristotle's practice. Yes. And so then the question is, so there's parts of the Karbalski picture, as I will call it, that I like, and there are parts that I'm not quite sure about. So traditionally, this division has been set, whatever we justify by reference to observation, that's scientific. Whatever we justify by reference to argument is dialectic, or is some lesser status. I think some of what Joe is doing is sort of mitigating, obscuring that distinction. I think that's spot on. So what I'm wondering about is, like, these are not a priori arguments, right? So these are not the natural teleology itself has, according to Aristotle, empirical evidence. So he's testing these things against things that he thinks have not just arguments in favor of them, but things that can be seen. So the animal husbandry paradigm that I have in mind, so like, the years of experience that, people have who breed sheep and camels and horses, and how you're supposed to do that, and what kind of knowledge they give you about, and they provide weird, how wind impregnates horses, and Aristotle just reports that as being something that can indeed happen. So to me, the it's sort of similar to what the work that Andrea Falcon and I have tried to do with the use of eulogos, right? So when Aerosol refers to something that makes sense, or like what can be expected to be the case, it's not necessarily the case that what he's then saying is that this is just something you test by arguments. It's not like just an armchair kind of justification. It's actually supported by whole bodies of empirical evidence. But it's just that they're just brought in sort of wholesale without having to go in and say, how does this particular piece here fit in with that?
So yes, I understand that this kind of justification is so. The description that Joe gives us is that this kind of justification works by the sort of deductive argument. So you sort of deduce a conclusion from very abstract principles of that science. So I think that your text 16 is a good example. So the fact that what the female emits outside the uterus is not spermatic is somehow supported by the very general claim that nature does nothing in vain, which is, of course, based on empirical experience. But I think that, just to press a little bit on that issue, it seems that for many things that Aristotle says in many passages of the corpus, is that if some concrete observation or conclusive observation is given for or against a certain proposition, even if that proposition somehow can be derived from this very general statement, we should give preference to the empirical observation.
Right.
And that, of course, I'm not saying that this solves the problem. It doesn't, but still, it seems that we could say that Aristotle is, it seems that he's neglecting his prescription that we should give preference to empirical evidence in that case. So that's why I was a little bit worried about whether we should sort of generalize it as a methodological instruction on Aristotle's part. So I understand. So the general principle that nature does nothing in vain is based on experience, but when it comes to analyzing very particular propositions, you can justify that proposition in terms of those very general statements, but if there is direct empirical evidence against it, perhaps we should take a step back and reconsider for a bit our general framework in that science, and maybe try to accommodate that new evidence within its framework.
Yeah, so I feel that strain between sort of like what Aerosol says about how you're supposed to be doing this and then what he actually does. So there's a similar problem that I see text, let's see. So text 6, when he talks about the mistake the predecessors made about identifying the role of the lungs and the gills. So one mistake is that they didn't look for the right, they didn't do dissections. If they looked at the actual parts, they would have observed a structural similarity between them. And the other mistake is that he didn't assume the teleology of nature. And that seems to sort of go straight against this other remark about like the bee stuff. If you have, you should, what has ultimate authority are the observations. And here it just seems like he's saying, like, look, if you want to see well, you have to make the right kind of assumptions when looking. And one of those key assumptions is that nature is teleological. And so if that's sort of built into the observations, then this separation between like what's, direct observation and what's by argument gets completely muddled. And then, so what's left is a kind of distinction between sort of a priori type arguments and sort of arguments embedded in this natural scientific project, so to speak.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I admit that in some of those passages, it seems that those very general principles of the science are sort of governing the way Aristotle is approaching the phenomenon from an empirical point of view. So we don't get this clear division between those two. That seems correct. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Breno. And now we have Professor Marta Jimenez, who managed to join us in time. Thanks, Marta.
Thank you, Mariska. Sorry, I wasn't at the beginning. We are moving and our life is in chaos, but I'm happy that I caught your talk. It's super interesting, and those fascinating details about motherhood. I have a question that is, I think that's related to one of your conclusions, but I'm more interested in your section 6. About like how about the maternal bond and about how women are portrayed as kind of paradigm of benefactors, because it seems that so in relation to the conclusions that you're deriving, it seems that Aristotle will be interested in kind of like moving away from that and saying just like, well, women are but there is this other thing that men do that is more insofar being a benefactor is kind of like almost like a virtue, or just like in the range of it's a good thing, is the best thing to be. Then it will be, if we want to be consistent with like general kind of like a male predominance and preference, then it will have to be something like, oh, and men do this parenthood thing way better, and yet and he doesn't go there. So like in a sense, like that is kind of like that is getting him to just be attending to observations and maybe kind of like cliches or like whatever people say in their time also in order to derive that conclusion, which is interesting. And I was wondering whether thinking about the different kinds of friendships in the Nicomachean Ethics, when he discusses the parent-child relationship, the husband-wife relationship, there might be a hierarchy there that might just and then I was wondering in relation to that, like when he talks about the parent-child relationship in the Nicomachean Ethics, he seems to be talking about the male kind of like male parent relationship, and that is so that we cannot really have a sense of what this other kind of like parenthood or like motherhood thing would be in the case of females. But there might be some kind of like there's a hierarchy there maybe, and this information about women being the best kind of benefactors or like the paradigm of benefactors, the most might feel like in a weird way with all that other information.
Yeah, so that part, it's super confusing to me. Thanks for that question. So this is where this is the part I have not worked out very well. So I don't quite get why, like how motherhood and like the relation of mothers with their children can feature so large, like within the discussions and sort of to highlight particular features of philia, but they don't get their own chapter, they don't get their own section. And then it seems to me that perhaps, yeah, it's weird. So women are the paradigm for for what it means to be a benefactor, because it's all about production and your own thing, and children are most of all your own work and production. I mean, it's clear that the asymmetry that is involved in the maternal relationship to her children is also exactly the kind of thing that prevents her from, engaging in a kind of virtue friendship. But I'm super confused about. I'm also kind of confused about the whole appeal to what is natural in this context of because it doesn't seem to me that the three types of friendship Aerosol is distinguishing are necessarily natural types of friendship. I mean, they're sort of right.
Yeah.
So
it is confused. Like that. Now that you're saying that, I think that the confusion goes all the way down, and Aristotle himself kind of slides, because there is this passage that you quote from the Generation of Animals, I think it is, that Sophia Cornell also talks about in her paper about parenting at the very beginning. That is this thing about how animals have this care and love for their offspring, and humans do too, and we do it in a way that extends throughout our lives, and even after our life, and that there's a slide there, because it seems that the kind of parallel that he wants to do with care for the offspring will be with the female side.
Right.
And yet that caring, being a sign of intelligence and being it as something that expands throughout our lives is more under the model of the male side. I think, I don't know, this is a speculation, but it sounds to me that he's sliding there. He's just moving from this kind of caring to that other kind of caring and putting them on a line in a way that it might not be allowed because of the way he's talking about it. I don't know. I see the confusion.
I mean, so that particular text, it's the context of talking about chickens and eggs and why mothers stick around. They sit on the eggs until the chicks come out, and then they're like, bye, now we're done. And so that whole discussion comes up in the context of talking about mothers, and then the reference to phronesis there, I find super confusing. Even if it's a natural analog of phronesis, So some other animals have the natural analog to that, and women might have the natural analog to that, but that rings definitely that definitely brings in sort of the paternal friendship.
Yeah, so and in relation to that, a last point that is also inspired by I read Sophia Cornell's paper recently, and there she wants to make this argument that we can just look at Aristotle as a kind of someone who gives us a good model how to think about parenting, in the sense that it's just parenting is a way of developing important parts of self, and if that's the case, then this kind of the break between female and male, it would be problematic insofar if parenting and this kind of love for the offspring is something that gets you to develop into just a more complete, or or it is something that is a virtue, then it will be something that we want to kind of elaborate more on the male side. Insofar, that would be the paradigmatic kind of virtue.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's so part of it might just be that for Aristotle, it's the mother who's within the household, sort of in charge of that primary care and the primary raising of children. But I don't know. There's the other thing that just occurred to me. So what is, of course, unique for women in antiquity, which is also something that Aerosol mentions, is that they alone are certain of that they are the mother, the parent of their children. So for fathers, there's always this question mark. And so that might mean that there's a sort of some kind of distinction, why women really know that children are their work.
Yeah, cool.
But
yeah, well, thank you. Maybe we can in the future talk about this, because I find it very interesting, and there is a real if you kind of figure out the cracks about how those texts fit together, that would be fantastic, because it's a real mess.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks.
So thank you, Marta. Now it's Roberto, the last one of the debaters, before we move on to the question from the audience. Roberto, please.
Thank you. I only have a question about details, really. And the reason is that I'm also very perplexed about this thing about the number of teeth. So of those. And at the end of the day, it seems that we don't really have a very good explanation of why Aristotle at the end made this very embarrassing mistake, especially if you are declaring the importance of empirical observation and so on, and then
Right.
you.
Yeah.
So my first question is about that passage, and it's probably just a doubt out of despair, and it's how unlikely is that there is not talking about number of teeth, but rather about the size of them. And it's I think if we just look at the dictionary entry, is not exactly impossible, or shouldn't be impossible. I don't know how unlikely it is. I was trying to read, I don't know the passage, I was trying to read that passage quickly. From the context is, I mean, I wouldn't exclude it immediately, but I know on my part it's just a move out of this despair, because it's very, I mean, there is no need to say that. Is someone who is making other observation about facing various animal species in the Historia Animalium, and then he says that it's clear, it's been observed, it's not being observed in other animals. So my first question would be that, would you totally exclude that type of move to save Aristotle from this very embarrassing thing? And the other one is still about the other evidence about Aristotle very weird mistakes, very non-empirical mistakes, and it's about that passage that in the Insomnis. I remember that passage because I was studying perception, and I always found it interesting. But I remember many scholars think that it's not authentic, that passage. And basically the reasons are context, because it seems, but it's debated. Some people say that it doesn't really break the continuity of the chapter, but some others say that it's clearly just a digression, very big, but it's still a digression. And the second one that I think is more important is that there Aristotle says that the organs are making something. He says the site, or the organ of sight, poie and antipoie, so it reacts to, and which is actually the reason for me, because as Lucas would say, I have some horses in the race. And for me, it was a reason always to think that this is actually a very interesting and authentic passage. But for many people, it's really not compatible with what Aristotle says about. So it would be, let's say, textual questions about these two passages. And also, if I can, are there other examples of the same gravity that where we can see immediately and in a very worrisome way that Aristotle is making this sort of mistakes, even if he's declaring the importance of empirical observation?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Let me write this down. So I think in general, my inclination is to, if there's decent manuscript support for a passage, and it doesn't seem like the language seems similar enough to accept it as Aristotelian, and only to kick it out if it makes no sense at all. So I think our inclination should be to try and make sense of the passage as we have it. I don't see any reason to kick it out, apart from the fact that it's saying something totally crazy. And I can see people wanting to, being reluctant to attribute something like that to Aristotle. So I have not studied the whole chapter in detail, but from my sort of superficial read, it seemed to sort of flow. It wasn't the most natural transition, but it seemed to illustrate fairly clearly like the phenomenon he had just been talking about. So it didn't seem out of place to me. So the question with teeth, so that's possible. So it would make more sense if Aristotle had been talking about like tusks or like, or like defensive teeth that are not just used for grinding food, but that have defensive purposes as well. But the group of animal he mentions, so like the sheep, goats, and pigs. I mean, that's there's tons of sheep in Athens, in the wider area around Athens. Like Athenian wool is like the famous thing that they're exporting at this time. So the idea that he couldn't, so maybe he couldn't have checked his wife's mouth because of eidos or whatever, but surely he could have looked at a couple of sheep to see what was going on. So that I find weird. It would be nice to have some more straightforward account of that. The other thing I'm thinking is that in History of Animals, I think it's in the first book where he goes through all of the features that you find on an animal's head. He will say stuff like, animals have two eyes when they are, when they are green, they're best for seeing, and if they're blue, they indicate that you're talkative or something like that. Or ears, if they are set from, so it lists like functional features right along physiognomic signs, right? So where Aerosol makes pretty crazy claims, but they're integrated in the same sentence, where you can't just say, oh, this is a later interpolation, because you would have to cut that out 7 times within a sentence, because there's a bunch of physiognomical signs there. So I think just the idea that something strikes us as very odd is not a good criterion for thinking that something must have struck Aristotle as equally odd. There might have just been, especially in the context of the HA, I think he might have been way more. So I think the HA certainly, what he included there has gone through one level of vetting, right? But he's happy to include things that he knows are wrong, just to tell us that, that he knows of this as well, and then tells us what it's actually wrong. And there's tons of stuff in there that's just crazy, like the account of the European bison, where we get this very visual description of the color of its hair and the size of its stature, and then it goes on to say, and then when it's ready to build a nest, it builds a nest out of manure. And when it's being chased, it will fling poop into the air. And when it hits you, it has these burning features. But it does not have these burning features when it's using it to build a nest. And it's it goes from nice empirical description of some animal I'm not familiar with to straight up crazy fable-like stuff. And that's all in the History of Animals. So it's very well possible to me that Aristotle, it has been observed. So this is some account that came to him from, from whomever. And he thought, well, sure, it makes sense to me that men have more of something than women do. Because, they have more defensive parts, they have bigger bodies. So maybe at first blush, this was something that made sense to him. He wrote it down, and then there was never any reason to go check that it was actually true. That's the best story I can give for that.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Roberto is satisfied. Now we have one question from the audience by Guta Silva. I'll put it on the screen. It's a little bit big, but I think it's worth it. So here's what she's asking. She says, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle normally attaches his theories to what is said by the people. He starts from the common sense, and then he follows a logical reasoning to find the truth about that saying. And she follows, it seems in your explanation that it's not the same for inquiries on biology. The participation of women in the polis is an ethical issue, and Aristotle justifies that women cannot participate in politics. Besides the lack of phronesis, also because of physical constitution, since they have more fluids, they're more emotional. Thus, it seems he mixes the methodology of reasoning for biologists with the ethical reason. And then she asks, so am I correct to think that he's actually applying the common sense as facts in those explanations about women? And what could justify his mistakes? And she adds one that I'm not sure I got, but maybe you do. And she says, it is your tentative conclusion one, but including endoxa from not only experts, but from the common sense. And she asks whether you think that makes sense.
Okay, so that's a lot. Let me see what I can pull out from that. So there's a vague parallel, at least in the way Aristotle studies nature and the way that he approaches his ethics. So the two phases is sort of similar, where in the natural treatises it's supposed to be observations first, then explanations. And it looks like in the ethics, what we get is endoxa first and then definitions next. So there's a similar two-stage kind of thing. And then in both cases, I think the actual picture then gets a bit more muddled because, well, actual science is more, it's not as clean as your theory would like it to be. And then there's more questions about the similarities and dissimilarities between how Aerosol approaches his ethics and his biology. And I'm just not enough of an ethics scholar to answer that. So I know Joe Grabowski has written about that quite a bit. So the other thing is about Aerosol's approach to women. So I take it that so in the overall approach, Aristotle takes the views he has about women in the biology and builds on that in the ethics. So how that exactly fits in with how you're supposed to be doing ethics, that's a different question. Briefly, I think it's the fact that women lack natural heat that causes them to have all kinds of physical deficiencies, that causes them to have characterological defects that makes them more fit to being ruled as opposed to ruling themselves, and that potentially also leads into their deliberative capacity to having some kind of lack. Now, does Aristotle use common sense as part of his endoxa? I think was the question of as part of his facts. So maybe not directly, but to the extent that they fit with everything else that he thinks, yes. So the idea that there's a hierarchy among the sexes, so that's something that clearly has its roots in common sexism of the time, and that features again within his natural teleology. And in that sense, I think it does feature as a kind of reference or check for the comments he makes. It's not clear to me that just plain common sense in general has a role to play in the method as such. Although I'm not sure if that answers the question.
I can ask Guta whether or not she's satisfied here in the chat, so I will wait to see if anybody else has further questions. Anybody at all? Roberto? Oh, I think we do have somebody else. Marta would like to ask a follow-up.
Hi.
Hi, thank you. So I was a little shocked, and maybe I don't know how to think about this, but I was a little shocked when you said that Aristotle takes his discoveries in the biology and he just works with that in the ethics. it seems
People don't like that when you say that.
they do, okay, good, because I thought that the common idea is that it's the other way around, and that he comes with his prejudices from kind of like his politics and his ethics, and then he just like flags it in order to derive certain conclusions about the biology. So like I was curious to just like I'm happy to just like I saw something that was kind of provocative there. Like what are your reasons to hold that?
So my reasons are, I mean, so it's a
That's a big question. That's a big question. You just got like a little bit like just like the short of it.
So there's a couple of things. So I don't buy into this idea that, you know, because for Aristotle, the sciences are autonomous. That means that ethics and biology have nothing at all to do with each other. And that when Aristotle says shitty things about women in the ethics, that's unrelated to the shitty things he says about women in the biology and vice versa. So the reason why I think the biology has some kind of priority are twofold. So one has to do with the role I see for like what kind of training the future lawgiver needs to have had before he can go off and like create his own city. So there's this passage where Aerosol says like political science does not create humans but receives them from nature and then uses them. And I think that suggests that, you know, humans come with their human nature. And given the human nature that we have, you know, the fact that we're political, the fact that we reproduce in certain kinds of ways, that we form friendships in certain types of ways. So that has to inform whatever constitution, whatever community you're going to build. If your community rules conflict with the kind of beings that we are by nature, then it's not going to work.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. So in that sense, sort of, you know, humans come out of nature, like, right? And then whatever the ethicist is doing is building on that and perfecting that nature.
Sure. So I mean, but your view is more radical than that, because you can have some kind of like a give and take. It's just like he portrays himself, what he's doing, as the biology has preference or like a priority insofar like we are first like human, like we are natural beings, and that's the given in a way. And then like in politics, which is all that good, and I think that shouldn't be super controversial. The controversial part is kind of like that it sounds like you don't want any kind of cross-pollination. So it is, because I think that kind of like the common view that I was kind of like immersed in, so it might take me a while to get out of, but I'm open to, is that sure, he uses a lot of like his science in order to ground ethical claims, but also he does have a bunch of like ethical prejudices and political prejudices that kind of like seep in the way. And I think that that's what you're after in this research about like motherhood, is that there seem to be a number of prejudices that are seeping in the kinds of things that he's saying, scientific claims that he's making. And in a way, there's like a little bit of like a retrofeed. It's not just like only one directional. And like even for your own purposes of the present paper, I think that kind of like back and forth, it's more to your benefit.
Yeah, so that might be true. So I think, so as a description of the practice, I think that might be right, that there is some cross. And then as a matter of methodology, I think the biology is foundational for the ethics. And
good.
then
So that means that when he's doing that, he's not following his own method. Like he's saying, this is my method. And then when he's kind of like letting the ethics intervene in the biology, he's failing to be a good scientist according to his own criteria.
Yes. And so the question is, well, like, what exactly are those examples? So I see a lot of examples of the natural sort of seeping into the ethics. And then there's a question of trying to figure out exactly whether something is going in the other direction and what's going in the other direction and what it's doing with the biology. Yes.
Okay. And these questions about motherhood are kind of crucial for that, because that's where like all the prejudices are going to come out.
Because motherhood, it's both this, it's a deeply biological thing and a deeply social thing, right? It's like the main telos of women in antiquity. Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Thank you.
So let me put everybody on the screen, just to thank everybody for their presence here today, especially Mariska for the wonderful lecture. So that is it. This is it for the 8th meeting. We'll have the 9th in about a month's time with Professor Gilles Pearson. He has not yet confirmed the title of his lecture, but as soon as I have it, I'll make sure to send to you all. Thanks everybody for the presence.
Thank you, everyone.
See you again soon.